So how was your spring break?
Too fast.
Too fast?
I was sick.
Oh yeah, you were still sick. Well, and in one of my classes, I found out two of the students, for whatever reason, thought that the spring break was 2 weeks. And it took their friends getting a hold of them on Tuesday saying, "Where the heck were you?" That they realized, oh, but I don't know. That sounds a little bit too vapid to be a manufactured excuse. So it's probably valid.
Yeah, how was your trip up north?
Well, it was really Monday. I had 5 people signed up for the workshop because the workshops are for like LDS church designers and architects and stuff. Thursday, when I went up there were 2 people, but it was still, they were 2 people that I still wanted to be there for. One of them was a big architect. And then Friday morning, a half an hour before the workshop was supposed to start, I got emails saying that they couldn't make it after all. So it was disappointing. But I took the opportunity there was a company I've been working with where they have lots of projects going on. I took the opportunity to connect with them and just go over and see what they were doing and how things were progressing. I was able to spend a day with them going through and defining a lot of the projects. So it was actually really worthwhile. It was good. And the kids took me out to, well, we didn't end up going out. We tried to and found it was an hour and a half wait at the place they wanted to take me to. So we ended up getting, Uber Eats or whatever. It's not Uber Eats. It's one of the other ones, one of the clones. And it actually ended up being pretty nice.
Very good.
So, but how do you guys remember much about the Harlem Renaissance that we talked about last time? What were some of the things you really liked about it?
I like the positivity, like look into the future, but positively, let's make some changes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Joey.
Oh, no, sorry. You go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Say what you were going to say.
I was just gonna back that up. I had the same takeaway. Like my initial thought was how positive it was. But there's also I would add it's really hopeful. There was this grand vision for the future that was based on ability, and like they weren't held back, or there wasn't any of the nastiness we hear from like futurism or any of those sorts of things. It was just really hopeful and positive.
Yeah, I really liked how generative it was, how forward-looking, forward-thinking, and it really very cool stuff. One thing that I thought was interesting was how the styles that were being used were ones that were really in full force in Europe and elsewhere in the international professional art community. And sometimes I get the feeling like when people talk about women artists of the Renaissance, for example, there's this assumption that girls can't do anything, and we've got to find the 3 women that did anything and then blow them up out of proportion so that we can claim that they rode alongside all the men that could really do it. I mean, I am kind of dramatizing that a little bit, but that's the feel that I got in grad school. That it was, yeah, here's this one girl that could do it. And look, she's almost as good as all the men. And now we realize with things as simple as taking an X-ray of the recorded signature and finding out, holy crap, these are professional women. They had their own studios. They had the stay-at-home husband raising the kids. They had a network of schools going across the Netherlands or throughout Italy, and people were really paying top dollar for their stuff. It wasn't at all like it wasn't at all, let's give them a little something so we can validate their existence. It was, these were powerful, contributing people, professionals in their own right. And it's only through the darkened lens of history that we see them any differently, and then I carry that forward with the Harlem Renaissance. These are people at the top of their game. They really know their stuff. Nobody is giving them a handout by putting them into the art historical canon. They don't need a handout. These are incredible artists, period. And I think that's a really, those two things, the hopeful positivity and the just incredible professionalism, I think are two really strong takeaways that I had. And to see how that work remains impact in today's international art scene is something, like the things for the Negro Pavilion in the Texas exhibit. I mean, that kind of art is still powerful today and is still resonating through so many things today. And I'm thinking specifically, you can see, I can't remember the artist's name, but the guy who painted those murals in the pavilion, his work is underscoring a lot of the sci-fi adventure film, well, not sci-fi adventure film, but the tongue-in-cheek sci-fi adventure film on the international scene. The opening credit animations demonstrate a lot of that. And not just that, but there's other movies too, like I think Bullet Train, some of the artwork with the Wolverine movie, and then influencing even some of the other contemporary movies where you have animation sequences and stuff like that that are designed to be really powerful and dramatic. And I don't know, I think that's really cool. People think that they're fresh, they're neat, they're all that. They don't realize that this is resonating, out of 90 years of history, and that, or 100 years of history. That's the thing that I think is such a kick in the butt. Well, one thing that I observed coming into this week's subject is there is an awful lot of hopefulness in art, and people use art to reclaim identity quite a bit. I knew one of the guys who resurrected Tomoko back in the late 80s. He was doing this. He was a minimalist sculptor, and then started teaching himself Tomoko because at that time in New Zealand it was still illegal. And he started doing this, and he was arrested for doing it, believe it or not. And then he was turned around and they asked him to serve on a jury. And he said, if you're going to arrest me for being who I am and then ask me to be who I am, I really don't see how that's going to work. And then about 12 years after he was arrested, he was invited by the government of New Zealand to do the first public display of full lower body Tomoko. And a model volunteered, and he walked the crowd through absolutely every aspect of what Tomoko actually was. And this young lady sat through an extremely painful process over a course of about 2 weeks, but it really established Tomoko as an art form and in the international scene. And the reason why I'm pointing that all out is the resurrection of Tomoko and the new flavor put on it by today's tattoo artists is really reflective of this genre of visual art that came out of the emergence from a really horrible time. It's post-colonialism. People are reestablishing identity, and that's the kind of mind space I see this regionalism coming into, because we can see it. We're focusing mostly on American, touching a little bit on Mexican, but you can see it emerge in every post-colonial environment, as well as post-cultural traumatic environment too. The same, echoes of this kind of movement show up. And I'm particularly thinking of the Arab Spring about 10 years ago. Hopefully you guys remember a little bit about that. This BYU hosted an exhibit by a curator who brought together a millennium and a half of Islamic art shown at BYU Museum. And it was fascinating to me because they ended up making me a special docent because BYU had absolutely no idea how the BYU Art Museum had no idea that BYU is the largest private Christian university in North America with its own imam. There's an imam at BYU who is called to be an imam by LDS general authorities, and he holds prayer services in a room that is set apart and dedicated by LDS Christian general authorities for its use. And they had no idea. And you see the art coming out of the Arab Spring is a lot of it is very regionalist art in the same kind of vein of what we look at today, coming from a very similar set of circumstances, that it just takes place 80 years later in a different part of the world. And you see the same kind of thing showing up after the handover of Hong Kong, after the liberation of Indonesia, after all these decolonizing areas. Same kind of thing started showing up in India back in the 60s, 50s and 60s. And it shows up in a lot of different spaces, which I'm really looking forward to seeing the art that comes out of people who are healing from today's tragedies. I think that'll be really fascinating. But of course, the tragedy that we're talking about is the Great Depression. And it wasn't just an American event, even though, all of us that's what we were taught, that it was primarily, it was governed and defined by what happened in the US. But, if we're talking about the end of the 20s, early 30s, this is, at the time in Germany, for example, the Treaty of Versailles completely crushed the German pride and economy. And to get into the vein, I wanted to share this video with you that I thought was really, truly awesome. My internet has been having a little bit of an issue. Has been having a little bit of an issue. So let's hope it pops up. Can you guys see this? I'm sorry, I can't see anybody's faces. Okay, can you guys see the video? Okay, here we go. Can you see it now?
There we go.
Okay, all right. Now, for those who are joining in a later recording, this may be removed or edited out, but you do have the link in the module. Everybody has a rough life story, don't they? But with the Great Depression, there were a lot of factors that happened, and a big part of it was kind of a bubble economy that emerged after World War I. A lot of people were making a lot of speculation on the restructuring of the areas that have been torn by the war and have been impacted by the war. You also have the closing down of a lot of these colonial economies, leading to independence throughout the 50s, or right after World War II. And efforts to kind of stabilize their own economies, people were putting a lot of trade restrictions on their neighbors. And so, there's all this stuff going on, political turmoil, everything else happening. And that just led to irresponsible speculation throughout the world, and resulted in the Depression that hit, I'm sorry, there we go. So it wasn't just, oh, I'm sorry, I'm hitting all the wrong buttons, trying to share stuff with you guys. Oh well, I'll do the best I can. You know, so people go to bed one night and the next morning they wake up and they've lost all their jobs, they've lost their income, they've lost their life savings. And it was something that was trickled down across the world. So even though it is something that is very impactful to Wall Street, that was just one aspect of the whole thing. It was just something that happened everywhere. And I'm old enough to have stories from my grandparents about how they lived through the Depression. My parents were both born right before World War II, so they didn't have any memory of that time period. But it was, by many accounts, a period of a lot of hardship. Fortunately, my grandparents lived in areas where things were a little bit different, and one grandpa was able to drive from Salt Lake City to southeastern Washington State, and he was able to, because he said that he was able to move his whole family in his car at that time and have a safe space for them to be, so he wasn't too worried about them, and he was able to get jobs. He figured that during the Depression, he was only out of work for maybe about a week and a half. That was spread over the length of the Depression. And my other grandpa was in Montana at the time, and he was really fortunate that he was able to work with the industries supporting mining and keep his job during the Depression during that time as well. And it's very, fortunate for those two people, but a lot of people had a lot of hardship. At one point in the country, I think in the US, it was 28% unemployment. You go to someplace like Sierra Leone, where it was 95% unemployment. You go to India, where it was 80% unemployment. I mean, it was really harsh all around the world. Sorry about that. But so a lot of people were impacted. And then you get the same kind of thing going on with like the Harlem Renaissance. Everybody is uprooting and fleeing the states that kept them subjugated for so many years. A lot of artists throughout the US decided that they were going to make something out of this time period. And that's where you get the birth of what became known as American regionalism. And I wanted to play just a couple, again, these videos. If they don't show up, it's going to be something that is in the module. But I have 3 videos that are each about 2 minutes long that I thought would be really good to share. So I want you can see this page. I want you to watch all of these. Like this is about a 14-minute Great Depression episode. This one is about a minute and a half. And some of these 3 are articles. These are videos. And for whatever reason, Canvas was not allowing me to put videos on. So we'll see what happens. Let's see. And I am being blessed with ads on my YouTube. So here we're going to share it. All right.
They're purely American movements is going to be American regionalism, or American scene painting as it's sometimes called. And this is a naturalist style of painting and art that was popular in the first half of the 20th century. The artists of the movement will depict scenes of typical American life and landscape, painted in a naturalistic, fairly descriptive style. American scene is an umbrella term for the rural American regionalism and the urban and politically oriented social realism. After World War I, many United States artists will reject the modern trends stemming from the armory show, in part as a reaction to the war. Oftentimes, when we see war, we will see far more conservative movements following that war, and then things will develop from there. When we get to the next war, we end up with the same thing, a little more conservative, and then redevelopment once again. And we see the same thing around World War I as we do around World War II. So instead, they adopt an academic realism in depicting urban and rural scenes. Much of the American scene painting conveys a nationalism and romanticism of everyday American life. They're trying to create something that reflects the American life of everywhere between LA and New York oftentimes. And as an anti-modernist style and reaction against the modern European style, this American regionalism was seen as an attempt to define a uniquely American style of art. So as soon as we've seen the armory show and precisionism and surrealism, and the Americans are starting to get involved in all of these movements, all of these basically modern movements, we see this reaction back. So we're pushing back to a more conservative, more realist movement in this case. And that's not a bad thing. It's just one of these cycles that we see in art history. And it doesn't mean that we can sit there and look at history and go, oh, I can predict what's coming next. That's foolish. There's always a black swan. There's always something that you wouldn't expect at the time. But it does give us a general idea. So if you're looking at a painting, you can kind of start to date it based on realism versus abstraction, American versus European. So another...
I wanted to show you something. We looked at that. Let's see. In the early part of the 19th century, there was a movement called realism, where people were depicted in a fairly naturalistic style, but it was, let's see, I'm trying to find an image to share with you. Okay, that's not it. And I wanted you to look at this and tell me what you think. Okay, here we go. All right. If we look at this painting, it has a lot of that same kind of sensibility that we saw in the image shown in that short video. It's naturalistic. There's a lot of naturalism going on. It does feel like an academic exploration of the human form. There is perhaps a little bit of stylization in the way that colors are used. But what's interesting to me is the subject matter. In the 1800s, you get this really impactful element of society, middle income earners, who are able to pay for paintings that don't have to be celebrations of their contribution to society. They don't have to be celebrations of important points of history or biblical narratives. They can be things that the population is ready to see, or everyday events. Some of the paintings of this are two girls waiting for the ferry, where you see they have a donkey near them who just pooped on the road. Quarry workers, where you see guys working in the quarry. You know, it's not this highfalutin people standing around in an imagined landscape pointing at an inscription stone, and it's not Jesus on the cross or Jesus on the lap of his mom. These are ordinary scenes. And what's fascinating to me is that is really something that defines regionalist art.
Need a little help with your writing?
I'm sorry about that. Where it is this very strong naturalistic depiction of something, but it is a subject matter that people are very comfortable with. And I think it's intended, among other things, to kind of demonstrate a connection with the world that is not destroyed by the Depression or atrocious events, where it is not really a grasping, but maybe a hoping for return to normalcy, or at least a connection with normalcy. And that's what if this kind of movement showed up at any other time period in history, I'd probably think differently. But showing up right on the waves at the beginning of the Depression, like it does, I think that there is a certain amount of that motivation underlying it. So here's another short video as well by the same guy talking about what regionalism is instead of just introducing it.
The definition, or how can we define American regionalism? Now, the term itself does not signify an organized movement. Rather, again, like precisionism, we're looking at an aspect of broad tendency for American artists, in this case, to move away from abstraction and the avant-garde between the world wars. Now, keep in mind, there are other movements at the same time between the world wars. They're moving towards abstraction, such as precisionism. But here, they're working against. And oftentimes we have two different movements at the same time moving in separate directions. It's very common throughout history. Look at the Europeans with realism and romanticism happening at about the same time as one example. Now, these works will stress a couple of different ideas. For example, we will see local small-town themes, and that is strictly speaking known as American regionalism. This sort of small-town depiction or country depiction. Whereas if we move into the city, we're suddenly going to be looking at social realism, which looks a lot like propaganda in this case, and oftentimes does serve a very similar purpose. So when we see urban scenes within American regionalism, it is known as social realism, following the same basic trends and ideas that we will see with realism out of Europe about 75 years earlier. Now, regionalism is a realist, modern American art movement, where an artist shunned the city and rapidly developed technical advances to focus on scenes of rural life. So they're avoiding the technology, they're looking at rural life. Just like precisionism happening at the same time is focusing on technology and ignoring rural life. So again, two sides. The regionalist style was at its height from 1930 to 35, and the best-known artists were, of course, the regionalist triumvirate of Grant Wood, who we're going to be looking at, along with Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, and John Stuart Curry in Kansas. Now, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, these artists, the regional artists, will gain wide appreciation for their reassuring images of the American heartland. And much of this appreciation, I should point out, is very populist. It's coming from the people, from away from the sort of bright lights of the art market. So we're not seeing Frank Stieglitz and Gertrude Stein and others that we've been hearing about getting involved here. Instead, this is the average American kind of getting involved. So we have that difference between the people and the avant-garde. We're seeing that here with precisionism versus American regionalism.
Here's one thing you need to do before you buy anything online. Don't.
There we go. All right. So that is, I think, a pretty good encapsulation of the whole thing. And remember when we were talking about how during war times, you get both love songs and marches. You know, you get the militant marches, you get the the love songs, you get the odes. And it's fascinating to me where at this, at the one time we were looking at Bauhaus and all this highbrow stuff going on in Europe and in the Midwest. And when the Depression hits, there are still the people that are catering to that wealthy market, the artsy fartsy market. But then you also get this resurgence of identity almost, of what are the things that make life worth living. And I think that that's where the regionalism really comes about. And while we're talking specifically about the things that make small town America identifiable, this is where we get a lot of the visual imagery that later is labeled as nostalgic. I think regionalism can also be expanded a bit, where people are working with subject matter akin to what Europeans were doing during the realist movement in the 1800s. The subject matter is stuff that is easily identifiable and easily relatable to most of the viewing public, most of the people that encounter this work. And it's not just American rural life. I think regionalism pops up around the world in any and it shows itself in this kind of stylized naturalism that almost romanticizes the everyday events or environments that are specific to the population that's being addressed. And one of the things we'll look at a little bit later is Mexican regionalism, which, but you also see this resurging in the 70s and 80s with Native American regionalism. I went to Crazy Horse Monument, and there's a lot of really profoundly excellent Indigenous American regionalist painters who do the same kind of style in a contemporary setting, dealing with the exact same kinds of issues, same kind of environment, coming out of the trauma of enveloping post-colonialism and really asserting a powerful self-identity with the same kind of thing, but in subject matter that is relatable to their audience. You see the same kind of thing happening in Mao's China, with the Chinese propaganda art. You see the same kind of thing with the Soviet constructivists, when they're doing depictions of ordinary everyday worker life. You saw that resurging in the stamps made for the Moscow Olympics that the U.S. decided to avoid. And so I think it's just really fascinating that there's all these parallels going on. But I want to look at 7. We're including the triumvirate of the American regionalist painters, but I also am including 4 women that were doing stuff along the lines too. That and these artists don't always fit into that pre-Norman Rockwell kind of nostalgia kind of feel, but they are all dealing with very similar things, and I think it's really fascinating to look at. So of course we have Georgia O'Keeffe. We don't have to look at I have videos for each of these people that show their art. We don't have to do that. But Georgia O'Keeffe, she found kind of an emotional liberation in the American Southwest. And the reason why she's considered an American regionalist is because she dealt with this same, I'm sorry about this kind of thing. It shows up. I don't know how to get rid of it. But she deals with some of these are very naturalistic images, and some of these are really stylized and almost surrealistic, but they are very indicative of the area that she's active in. Like this is very indicative of the American Southwest. Let's see, I don't know how to get rid of that. We'll try to do it. Some of the things start to take on something of a surrealist perspective, where she puts things together that maybe don't occur in regular life. But some of the things that she did are also incredibly realist, where if this kind of weather vane was common in 19th century Europe, this is something that you would not be out of place with the European realists from 80 years earlier. And I think her stuff becomes really interesting seen from that kind of a perspective. And but let's go back up here to where her paintings are. And she was also very much feminist. And you can see that in a lot of the things that she chose to portray and focus on, particularly her large flower series. But even her landscapes have this kind of almost surreal look to them, where you have an ordinary landscape and it becomes stylized realism. And I think it's her take on it is really interesting. We get to Grant Wood and look at the stuff that he did. He is really a definer of the American regionalist movement. And by looking at his portrait, you can kind of see what I'm saying when it's stylized realism, where it doesn't feel quite naturalistic, but it is this almost academic quality. It feels more like the kind of posed portraits that were done when people sent in reference sketches to an artist. You know, this was a style that was actually shows up quite a bit at the end of the Enlightenment period, throughout a lot of the 1800s. When people were doing portraiture, they would do sketches and things like that, then go back to the studio and develop a painting from the sketch. And that's almost the feeling that it gets, where it's just slightly distorted realism. And not distorted to the point where it becomes abstracted, but his famous one is American Gothic. And this is the one that really defines American regionalism throughout the world. Everybody knows this image, and there have been thousands and thousands of images making fun of it, or pastiching it, or riffing off of it. You know, even Weird Al Yankovic, Amish Paradise, is a parody of Grant Wood's American Gothic, which you guys can see what I'm seeing in that, don't you? But then you look at his landscape, Arbor Day landscape. We look a little bit closer to this, and this is where you start getting that kind of stylized realism. It's realism in that you can easily recognize he's using a visual vocabulary that everybody can access, but and it is a very genre scene. It is a very ordinary scene, a cart and buggy going by a schoolhouse, and that's it. That's all it is. It's not highfalutin. It's not historically significant. It takes place in an event where kids whose parents look like they probably work on a farm, because of the way the kids are dressed, they're celebrating Arbor Day by planting a tree in the schoolyard. But then you start looking at it a little bit closer, and we see that the stylization comes in, that the grass is very cleanly defined, and it's set up on something of an improbable embankment. The strata of earth is very clearly defined. The bodies are stylized and smoothed out. They're simplified somewhat. You get a very clinical approach to perspective, lineal perspective, but that doesn't feel quite right, because it still feels like there's a little bit of distortion going on. But it's not distortion intended to put it into an abstract space. It's distortion that feels to me that is intended to clarify or simplify the narrative that's going on. Are you guys seeing what I'm seeing in that? And it's, let's see, I'm going to try to bring back to, yeah, we see this Parson Weems fable about the George Washington, I cannot tell a lie, I did chop down the tree kind of thing. You get the same kind of stylized realism, where it is an ordinary everyday scene, a kid chopping down a tree, but that is a really funky looking kid. I mean, you know, it's intended to be George Washington, of course, but it's fascinating to me how this tree is so stylized, and it almost it almost feels like the type of stylization you would do for wallpaper or fabric, you know, but it still is. You have this odd kind of space where it does feel like it might possibly exist in a naturalistic space, but it is also stylized the same way. And this kind of take on simplified naturalism is the thing that very much identifies American realism. And as we look at other artists, you'll see the same kind of thing going on. Doris Lee is somebody, and I believe, is it her? No, it's Isabel Bishop. That she actually was alive long enough that people took a film of her working in her studio. So yes, these are all artists that are rooted in the 1930s, but some of them survived into the 80s and 90s. And Doris Lee is another one of these artists who created work that again feels very much like that stylized realism. So the siesta is almost surreal. Like we looked at some of the surrealist artists. I would say it was entirely surreal, but when I met my sister, I think I mentioned was Shoshone. When I met her dad, her uncle, his house, they lived in on a reservation where a lot of the times the bed was outside because that's where they wanted to sleep, and it didn't rain very often. So this was almost, I didn't realize until later that this was a very surrealist presentation. And I think it's interesting, a lot of her work deals with these kinds of stylized, realistic, junctions of human portrayal, taking everyday, ordinary living objects, putting them in slightly different, out of the way places. But and in some of the areas that I lived in Alabama, this kind of a thing is not all that out of place. It's not really all that surreal, with the difference being that if you did have the bed outside, the mattress pad would be on it, but it wouldn't be made up with a quilt and pillows at all. But her stuff really, there's also a little bit of a resonance, I feel, to Frida Kahlo in what Doris Lee was doing. So really some interesting stuff. And then I wanted to share, well, after I show you Thomas Hart Benton, I want to talk again about some of the things you see that are similar among these different artists. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought this had more images than it did, which is why I selected it. Oh, yeah, this is a really good website because it has his, this is his website where a lot of his imagery is collected. Now here's portraits. I believe that these are self-portraits. Oh, no. This is a self-portrait on the right. On the left, it's a portrait of another artist. We get the same kind of feel of the stylized realism. Same kind of thing going on. He did a lot of farm scenes, landscapes, people in the cotton fields, sharecroppers, things like that. And there are other images as well, but I think this is a pretty good perspective on the kinds of stuff that he did. What are some of the common themes that you're seeing with this American regionalism?
I feel like it's sort of offering like a sense of pride in the work that's being done and like the life that's being lived. It's I don't know, it's depicting it in a way that feels almost glamorous. It doesn't feel like it makes it feel like worthwhile.
Yeah, and I don't, it's not glitzy at all, but it is clean, I think. How about you, Brittany? I think it's cute that you have a hand up.
So I was just thinking along with that, there's it's like the images are very bright and they're kind of flat. So like if there's a shadow, it's just a distinct shadow. There's not a lot of turning forms and stuff like that. But it is realistic in the same breath, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I get it. It's this almost surreal, stylized way of depicting three-dimensional form, where it feels less like real cloth and more like cloth wrapped around a pipe. You know, we don't get a lot of the delicacy and intricacy that you get in work that was even done by the Romantics or the Hudson River School. I think it's really fascinating. So I want to share with you a couple more artists. And a lot of these artists, like I said, there are the three big men that are easily identifiable, but there are the other four artists that I'm sharing with you are the four women that really defined a lot of the movement. And let's see. And Isabel Bishop, she is the one that survived, and she was actually documented working in her studio. She describes how when she first started painting and drawing, she thought it was kind of hoity-toity to use models. So she decided not to. And for a while, she just was getting more and more frustrated because of the lack of reference, you know, the lack of interaction with her subject. And so she started using models again, but they were people that she would direct to have move around in natural poses. And then when she found natural ways without posing, and then she would ask them to stop and return to what they were doing. So she arrived at the poses without posing, but by rather making mental snapshots of people's activity and then having them, you know, get back in that position again. And I think it's really fascinating seeing how she started creating stuff. In these tableaus, this is one of the situations that they filmed her making, where she would have people just walk around until she found that they've just naturally coalesced into a good pose, and then she would have them hold their spots, which I think is really interesting. So these are all sketches, and then she started doing. Later on, she was also doing drawings and paintings that felt a little bit more stylized. And I think it's really interesting to see. There seems to be a little bit of resonance with some of the things that we see in like the Harlem Renaissance style kind of stuff with what she was doing. And here we see some of that, like with Grant Wood and the way that he would depict figures. We see a lot of that. I see some of Edward Hopper in this, and we'll see Edward Hopper later. But these figures, I think, are interesting. They were done right before this movement started picking up, and I can see a little bit of the flavor of the way that Picasso would depict his figures as he started to develop Cubism. And it's fascinating to me to see that. And then as she starts getting closer to the American regionalist time period, it really picks up a lot more of that kind of simplified realism. I think her work is really interesting. And there's a lot of these scenes where instead of seeing like a cow in a field or kids at a schoolhouse, you see women talking to each other or people sitting at a soda fountain. And I think that's really interesting to me. This is very much a product of American regionalism, but it also feels very much, again, like that 19th century realism as well. A lot of really fascinating stuff. I find that there's, this I think is really beautiful right here. So very interesting stuff. And then we get John Stewart Curry. He is another one of the triumvirate of the male artists that define the movement. And I think his stuff is really fascinating because this, I start seeing, you know, the Nazi and Soviet supremacism that was started showing up right around World War II, where, you know, you get the Nazi ideal, the Aryan ideal celebrated as a monument, and you get the proletariat, the worker ideal celebrated as a monument. And that really picks up during the World War II as propaganda art. But I think you can see a lot of that in this almost celebration of the process of work and the struggle of everyday work. This looks very much like Soviet or Nazi propaganda work, which I think is really interesting. And even the circus tent image is really fascinating. But I look at the way that he did his horses. Study for the Prize Stallions. Do you guys remember the Super Salad restaurant that was throughout Utah for a while? It was like a precursor to there's what's it called?
Zupas.
Supas, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. Their branding involved this kind of very much the American regionalist work of John Stewart Curry. And you know, you look at particularly this. They had that the stylized, celebrated worker hero with the huge arms and body and the contemplative head, where it looks like the figures become monuments, as opposed to depicting just people. And I think that that's really fascinating. And then one of my favorite artists is Anna Hyatt Huntington. And she was a painter and a sculptor as well. Let's see, there we go. And there is this particular, it's interesting to me, a lot of the portraiture she did is along those same kind of lines as some of those other artists that we saw, where it's very academically naturalistic, but there's this kind of cleanliness about it that is where you're not going after, the artist is not going after the pimples and all the extra wrinkles. I mean, it is a lot of very clean work. And she sculpted in bronze quite a bit. You look at, you know, we think of Remington sculptures. You know, you look at this and you think of the Remington realism, and her stuff is very much realistic. And a lot of her work spanned that whole period between Cubism and abstract expressionism, but she keeps going back to the stylized realism that I think is really fascinating. You know, so you get the very genre or the very ordinary type subject matter. You know, here's a llama, here's a boar, the rhino and lioness, and Marin Full seem to be a lot share something of a more. I'm sorry about that. There we go. Share something more of a maybe an editorial to her artwork, but I think it's you know, a little bit more of a dramatic story maybe. But I think it's really fascinating that she's doing what she's doing, and there's a lot of her work. This is all cast aluminum. A lot of her stuff was also recast in bronze and patinaed by other artists as well. And her work just really feels solidly grounded in that kind of clean naturalism, like what we've noticed with the other artists. What do you guys think about these artists? Do you feel that they still fit very solidly into that same kind of framework of perspective as what we've been seeing? What's interesting to me is that these are not guys that had a shared manifesto. George O'Keeffe did not write to Mr. Wood and say, hey, this week I'm going to be doing a painting on red cliffs, doing it in this style. What are you going to be doing? They didn't care what each other was doing. This all arose out of this almost Gestalt desire to the Gestalt that demonstrated a desire to reestablish an American identity. And that's one thing I think is really interesting. So it's a movement in that it was geographically bound. I'm sorry. It was a movement in that it was bound to a specific period of time, reacting intellectually to a specific series of events that was going on. But these artists collectively decided individually to react in the way that they did, which I think is really fascinating. And again, I think it gives a certain amount of resurgence of hope for humanity that all these people in a very depressing period collectively decided, without coordinating with each other, to generate a world of hope. And I think that that's really kind of exciting. Now, from this time period, you get Herbert Hoover as the president at the beginning of this, and then who's the president midway through the Depression?
That's FDR, right?
Yeah, it's Roosevelt. And one of the things that he became very concerned for is the role of the politician, as the people life at that time were going to be voting more. And that's very cynical, but he became very aware of what actual people needed to feel that their voices were heard. And one thing that very much frustrated him was the fact that Congress, where they were so isolated, politicians were so isolated in Washington, D.C., that they had no idea what people were doing in the rest of the world. And he tapped a guy whose economics works he was really interested by, named Roy Stryker, who's a professor at Columbia University. And so he talked to a professor and he asked him to develop some sort of a program with the intent being that Congress was forced to acknowledge what human beings were doing outside of Washington, D.C. And this became the Farm Bureau photography project. It was actually the Farm Security Administration photography project. Now, when you see this image, it was done by one of the professional artists tapped by Professor Stryker to head up this project, Dorothea Lange's migrant mother. And this very quickly became, at the time, the symbol of the Okie plight, the mass migration. During the 30s, we're not just talking about economic failings, We're talking about the burst bubble of housing projects, lots and lots and lots of international trade being squashed. We're talking about people's restructuring after World War I failing, the boom economies after World War I failing. We're also talking about one of the worst economic disasters. If anybody doubts that humans have an impact on the global environment, all you have to do is look at the 30s during the Dust Bowl. Thousands of poorly educated farmers, and I'm talking about poorly educated in the ways of farming, completely stripped the topsoil and completely destroyed irrigation patterns, natural, and they had no idea how to irrigate their own fields. They had no idea how to take care of topsoil. They had no idea how to rotate crops. And very quickly, because of all the arable land, newly irrigated land, and poor farming practices over huge area of land, it dramatically changed weather patterns. And you started having droughts, and you started having dust storms because of how badly the landscape had been managed. And you get a manufactured environmental disaster. And then you get the economic disasters. A lot of the societies that depended on trade with this farm culture collapsed as well. And people went around, particularly to California, to try to find work. And have you guys been to in Utah to see the Boulder homes? Have you guys seen those? The Oklahoma people in Oklahoma on their route to California would stop as they were going through Utah, and there were areas where boulders had fallen from the red cliffs. And this is around Best Friends Animal Sanctuary. Where's that? Kanab.
Yeah, so it's Vermilion Cliffs. Yeah, I have been there. I didn't know that's what those were.
Yeah, you go in, the boulders were hollowed out by natural erosion, and people would make homes in them. And there's still a couple that you can go in and see where people, a family of 6, lived in one of these boulder homes, and you still see a lot of the implements and stuff like that they left behind when they finished their migration to California. These burnt out car hulks, when their cars would fail, people would adapt the car and turn it into a house. These are all evidence of that economic migration to California. So there was a lot more going on. But with the FSA, what Professor Stryker did was very selectively picked professional artists. And they were not all professionals. It was about 24 photographers. And these were white men, black men, white women. I think there was a Latino woman. So he was trying to very selectively put together a group of competent photographers that were also professional artists. Some of them were graphic illustrators. Some of them were painters. And many of them were also professional photographers as well. And he was trying to select a group of them that also represented the statistical spread of the American population, because he felt that would help them. It would help make a more fair distribution of what they chose to photograph. But then he sent them out, and the 3 rules that he gave them were, well, he asked them to photograph ordinary events. Don't look for tragedy. Photograph everyday ordinary events. So genre events, just like had been painted by the regionalist painters. And the 3 rules that they had to follow was, it must be a real event. It could not be staged or dramatized by the artist who's using the tool of photography. And they could not be coached or posed or made up or influenced in that way by the photographer. And what happened was it generated an archive of photography that more than any other era really helped people to see what was going on from the perspective of those photographers throughout the country. And it was astounding. I have 2 videos here for you to look at that I want you to visit when you can. And these 2 videos are really giving a history. It's done by an Iowa university, and they're giving a history of the Farm Security Administration photography program and talk about some of the things that they did. Some of the interesting things that happened were that one of the photographers who was going through the South just happened to be going through an area where that was at a time period right after a lot of the banks kicked farmers and sharecroppers off their land because they just, in the middle of the Depression, called in their loans. And these people had no way to go. And the photographs are of hundreds of people walking along the road trying to find a new place to be. And a lot of the photographs included white people, brown people, black people. It was just everybody that represented America. And the photographer, who happened to be in the right place at the right time, took those photos and had them flown to Washington, D.C. so President Roosevelt could see it. And he showed them to Congress, and they were immediately able to pass legislation to help the people that were evicted, that were homeless, which I think was really pretty amazing. And here are just some photographs of the documentation. Now, what is interesting to me is that this did a couple things. This, we have the kind of realist subject matter that you saw with the 19th century realism and you saw in the American regionalist painting. But I think it's interesting to me also that these are beautifully done photographs. You can tell that this person is a professional photographer who is also trained as a painter or a graphic artist. It's fascinating to me that you can tell that these people were not just taking arbitrary snapshots, they were making art pieces with their photography. And I can really see Professor Stryker's direction too. Here's just a farmer holding a calf. And here's just people in the home that's a tent, a kid just playing with a toy gun. And it's really interesting to me that it's not just white America that was being portrayed. It was everybody that was impacted. Mexican Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans. It was a lot of different people. And I think that the photos became a beautiful documentation of ordinary genre life as well. A lot of really beautiful imagery. Now, what's fascinating about it to me too is because of the direction that Professor Stryker gave them, these are not posed, they're not intended to make you feel sorry for the people. They are intended to be documentation. And because of his direction, I think it really kind of established fundamental ethics that documentary photographers still deal with, and still used to inform their work. Russell Lee, he is an amazing photographer, absolutely astounding guy. This artist is also one of the artists. Do you recognize his name from when we looked at the Harlem Renaissance? He was like the Stieglitz of the Harlem Renaissance. Absolutely beautiful, amazing work. And can you see what he is purposely referencing in this? What is he referencing here?
Hey, sorry, interject. This is Gordon Parks' work.
Oh, Gordon Parks. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
This is Russell Lee. This is Gordon Parks. Gordon Parks is who I was talking about. I'm sorry. The problem with when I'm thinking one thing and not concentrating on what I'm reading.
Huge fan of Gordon Parks, so I had to just throw that out there.
Yeah. No, Gordon Parks is the Stieglitz of the Harlem Renaissance. You know, he's amazing. Absolutely amazing on every level. This particular photograph, what is he also referencing that we just saw a couple minutes ago?
Yeah, it's American Gothic.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And Gordon Parks was specifically chosen by Stryker, Professor Stryker, because of his professionalism, because of his work in the Harlem Renaissance, and because of his international recognition as a professional artist. I mean, he wasn't just picked because they needed to have a poster child representing Black America. He was picked because he was a professional photographer and a real international artist. So yeah, I think he's absolutely amazing, absolutely astounding. So we get a lot of these, you know, a lot of these artists. And even though this is taking place between 1935 and 1944 is when these photographers were doing their stuff, it feels like it is that same sensibility, particularly this type of photo, as was very predominantly driven, or that predominantly drove the American regionalist art movement. Can you guys see that? Are you guys seeing what I'm seeing in this? I think it's absolutely amazing. Yeah, Gordon, thank you for the correction. That would have felt awful if people had thought I was talking about somebody else.
No, when we were learning about when you're talking about the Harlem Renaissance, like immediately thought of Gordon Parks the whole time. Just the way he depicts the the respect that he depicts his subject matter with, and the realness that he does it with. But yeah, love his work.
Well, and what is so beautiful to me about his work is there's absolutely no flavor of victimization in anything that he does. And there's no superhuman godlike monumentalization either. It just they're just beautiful works. I mean, there's no political subtext beyond what makes him who he is, and I think that's really beautiful. Now, I did want to touch a little bit on, we're almost done, but I wanted to touch a little bit on another regionalist genre, or a regionalist movement that I think was absolutely beautiful. The first couple of Mexican art. Who's that?
Frida and Diego.
Yes, absolutely. And they were the people that Diego was tapped to define Mexican regionalism, and Frida, just by being Frida, really defined, was the other pillar of defining Mexican regionalism. And so these two videos, we don't have time to look at them, but I want you to watch the links. Diego Rivera did a lot of work being very brutally honest about the brutal colonization of Mexico, and establishing pride, Mexican nationalism, by showing people this is what we've been through. This is the identity that we've developed. And Frida Kahlo, after she gained her independence from Diego, her first solo show in Europe was reported on by Mexican newspapers as the ex-wife of Diego did some paintings and showed them in a museum in Europe. And absolutely ridiculous, but she not only became a figurehead of Mexican regionalism, but she also became one of the defining figures of surrealism as well, which I just think is really amazing. And
now press that button.
I'm sorry, there we go. One of these artists that I want to share with you is Edward Hopper, and he is not considered one of the triumvirate of the American regionalist painters, but his work is profound. And I want you to watch the whole video. We're not going to watch the video. I'm just going to show you a couple of the things that he's did. These are black and white, but I want you to think of the movies that you've seen, particularly film noir or set pieces. Like if you remember the Nero Wolfe series that was done by A&E, Arts and Entertainment Network. These Edward Hopper pieces are done mostly late 30s, early 40s, right around that period. And instead of that country bumpkin American regionalism, he was very much the urban realist. And the work that he did was heavily influenced by life during World War II, life during the Depression in the city. And his stuff is incredibly emotional, but it's powerful enough that it shows up in cinema still today. You look at these paintings, can you think of cinema scenes, in movies that you've seen that resonate with with his work? I think of like Blade Runner, done in the 80s. There's a lot of scenes where Ridley Scott heavily depended on this. And then today, even in some of the contemporary inner city type set films, you see a lot of his set pieces showing up, or the kind of drama that is present in his work. You still see like this. There's some shots from Oppenheimer that are mirror a lot, or were heavily informed by what he did. And I think that's really kind of exciting to see how much of an impact he has still years later. And of course, I had to end off with showing this very, very short documentary. And if you guys go to, what's that big dam in Utah that they filmed one of the Transformers movies at? It's by Lake Powell. Oh, I know you guys know the dam. And if I remember the name, you'd slap your head and say, "Oh yeah, that's it."
Glen Canyon.
Is that what it is? Because Norman Rockwell was tasked by the federal government to paint something celebrating it. And there's a huge one of his paintings hanging up in the visitor center to the dam. But I just thought that this was kind of a fun thing. This is a painter who is an American regionalist that really defined American regionalism into and through the 60s as well. I mean, he kept going.
As a traditionalist, Norman Rockwell loved modern art. He was a great admirer of Picasso. He often wondered if he could have been a serious artist instead of an illustrator. One of his 1962 covers proved he could. At that time, Jackson Pollock was enjoying posthumous fame for his drip paintings. The style was well known, even if not appreciated by everyone. Rockwell thought he'd try his hand at producing his own drip painting. So he arranged the large canvas on the floor, then dribbled paint across it with the energetic swirls and swoops you see on the post cover. Only when he was finished did he superimpose his connoisseur, based on a model who posed with his quiet suit, fashionable hat, and umbrella. We are left to imagine the expression on the man's face. Does he love it or loathe it? Rockwell intended no mockery of Pollock's work. If I were young, I would paint that way myself, he said. He was 67 at the time. Out of curiosity, Rockwell submitted a section of the painting to the Cooperstown Art Association under an assumed Italian name. He took the top prize for painting. Those judges weren't the only ones to appreciate Rockwell's mastery. The abstract painter Willem de Kooning, recognized as the leader of avant-garde artists, is said to have remarked of Rockwell's abstract, "Square inch by square inch, it's better than Jackson."
I just thought that was kind of fun. And then, of course, there's his iconic Rosie the Riveter. This is actually modeled after, I think it was Isabel from the Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. But very, very cool. You know, this is a regionalist whose artwork is still impacting. You guys, I know you guys remember his painting, his iconic painting of the desegregation, little girl walking to the school, escorted by the government bodyguard. That just very, very, very amazing stuff. And he's one of those guys who's an American regionalist who was internationally recognized and still continued doing work up until he died, you know, in the 70s. And I think it's really very, very cool stuff. So what are your takeaways from what we've seen?
Can I jump in there? Yeah, honestly, this is connecting a lot of dots for me, just seeing how these styles are connected. I don't think I've ever like thought about all these different artists in the same basket. And really neat to sort of end on Rockwell, where, because, you know, you didn't really think of him as a fine artist, but you know, tying that into American regionalism, I can see how that just made artwork so accessible to so many people. Like that was like, you know, that was just like in everyone's home, still is. And then also my brain, you know, ping ponging, absolutely love Dorothea Lange, and, you know, such powerful work, birth of photojournalism, you know, basically using a camera as a tool for social change. So many powerful things came from that. And then just a kind of a fun other note is, you know, another one of my favorite photographers from that era, Edward Weston, was really impactful in Mexico with Frida and Diego with the work they were doing down there. He was sort of the intellectual backbone of that movement. So lots of stuff happening.
Well, who's the other photographer who did is famous for using a red filter to photograph a mountain? Ansel Adams. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Ansel Adams was very much an American regionalist too.
Yes.
You know, it's just, and you don't even think about that, because all we think about is his photographs taken out of time context. But he was very much doing what Georgia O'Keeffe was doing with the landscape, but he was doing it with photography. And he was doing it with the very same mindset at the same time period that these other guys were painting. I think that's absolutely fascinating. Yeah,
again, tool for social change. He was doing it as an act of, you know, for conservationism.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
How about your thoughts, Brittany, now that you can talk again?
I was just thinking, you know, back on the whole overall feel of everything. You know, you've got the Depression, you've got the wars, you got all this strife, and then all of a sudden you have people wanting to simplify things and make them peaceful and I don't know, get rid of some of the chaos that's going on in the world and bring joy through the art. And what a cool movement that is. Just, you know, it makes sense why artists were going this direction, because they wanted that peace, that hope, that just a clean, calm move towards something that made sense.
Yeah, and I think it never ceases to amaze me how you get people that are in the exact same situation and environment, and they choose to react very differently. You know, and these artists all choose to react with a very hopeful and almost celebratory air. You know, and I think that's amazing. That's the thing that's so astounding to me about the Harlem Renaissance. I mean, people have been kicked down for generations, dozens of generations, and they produce something so beautiful and hopeful. And then here people have lost their livelihoods, and every family has had somebody in their family commit suicide because of the loss of income, you know. And still, well, I don't know if I can say that word on YouTube. Committed significant self-harm, we'll say that, and because of loss of income. So people are in desperate straits, and it is not an exaggeration that many American families were boiling shoe leather so that they could feel like they were feeding their children. This is where you get things like the soda cracker pie, you know, and the lemonade soda, or the lemonade pie, or the soda pie. People were coming up with creative solutions to feed themselves, and still artists produced hope. I just think that's exciting. Very cool. Well, I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful week and weekend, and I look forward to talking to you all again on Wednesday.
Thank
Stay
you.
well.
Awesome.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. And when you see Van, just tell him how much he missed.
Well, he'll see us on this video. Hey, Van.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Oh, well. Hey, we'll see you guys later.
Hey, see ya. Thank you.